so much for taking the time to join us today for this conversation with Kristin Taylor. Before I introduce Kristin, I want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Suzanne Brinker. I am with Tarragona Associates. If you have not heard of us, we are a higher education consulting firm. Our services span everything from program planning and implementation, organizational assessment, student experience and support services, strategic planning, and more. And this webinar is aligned with our service area of student affairs, of course, and could not be more relevant at a time like this. So we're very grateful that you're here with us and to have this opportunity to speak with Kristin. We'll go to the next slide, where Kristin's picture is displayed along with her with a few notes. But Kristin Taylor is a life and executive coach and author. She started her career in higher education as a student success coach with Inside Track and has since really expanded that into life and executive coaching. And most recently has developed the courses Remind and Remind the Basics. And she will talk to us a little bit today about those courses, as well as the key principles that inform her work when she focuses on student mental health and wellness. Before we get started with a few questions to Kristin, we would like to engage all of you, the participants, in a poll. We would love to know how your college or university is prepared to manage student mental health concerns. And this is, of course, in your opinion. But if you could respond to this poll, and then Maureen, one of our partners, will be posting that same question into the chat if you want to elaborate there. And the chat is where we will have our questions and comments today. So I know there's also the Q&A function, but if you have questions or comments as we go along, please do also keep them in the chat and make sure that you send them to all attendees and panelists, not just the panelists. We would love to have everyone be able to see your comments and questions. And also, if you could drop in there your name and where you're from and what institution you're affiliated with, that would also be really wonderful. Just give you a couple of minutes or seconds to answer this poll. And we'll, of course, share the results as well. Very curious to see everyone's thoughts and opinions as to how their institutions are prepared to manage student mental health. All right, we will go to the next slide. And it looks like 67% of you, the majority, says that your institution is somewhat proactive, followed by an even 11% across all the other three options. So 11% say rarely proactive / only respond to direct requests for assistance, and 11% say proactive but more could be done, and 11% say very proactive. So somewhat proactive seems to be the most common response. Great. So Kristin, welcome. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. My first question to you is, when people think about mental health on college campuses, their first thought is often about suicide prevention or trauma response. Right now, of course, students are not on campus. They're in their homes. They have been dealing with a pandemic for 3 months and the social isolation that comes with that. And now they have also been dealing in the last week in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota and the protests that followed and have been following, dealing with this national crisis on top of the global crisis that is the pandemic. So how does your work fit in with all of that? And it is more than suicide prevention, right?
Well, exactly. And I love that you use the term, how does it fit in? Because I think of it as a tapestry. My course, to be clear, so a couple of things. Thank you so much for the introduction, but what I think is also important to know about me is that over 20 years ago, I was trained as a mental health therapist. So that's where I started my career prior to transitioning into higher ed I transitioned in about 13 years, where I started coaching. So I like to use the word tapestry because there need to be lots of different ways that those of us in higher ed are responding to the needs of our students and faculty and staff. That there are things like counseling centers where it's more of that urgent or emergent need that often they're attending to. I mean, there is such an epidemic of anxiety and depression, mental health need on college campuses. And I think of my approach with Remind, the course in the book, and Remind the Basics, also a shorter course in book, is about proactively equipping all of us with mental health coping strategies before they escalate to the place where people are saying, I'm in trouble, I need help immediately. Because what I know is often those waiting lists are just so long and you don't want someone to wait. And so for me, it's about saying this as a student, you know, they're signing up to change their lives, the time of transformation. This is critical material. How do we manage our emotional wellness so that justifiable fear doesn't escalate to the point of being an emergency or suicide?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. You have an approach that is unique. You combine narrative coaching with what is more well known as cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness. Can you explain your approach a little bit and the framework that you use?
Yeah, I think the best way to think about it, it is inspired and influenced by my training as what's called a narrative therapist, that I've transitioned into narrative coaching, which is a little bit different. And I can talk to that momentarily, but as well as neuroscience and mindfulness. But the way I think about it is most approaches to student success have a framework that says to a student, okay, here you are now, here you want to be. How are you going to get there? And it's about the how, meaning what are the skills, what is the knowledge that you need in order to succeed? That's a critical conversation. However, for many students, it's incomplete, especially if they're facing their own anxiety and fear. And so more deep conversations that can be a lot more meaningful, include what is your why? And I think of Simon Sinek, and I'm so grateful for what he has shared with the world in deepening. What is your why? Why does it matter to you? And yet that is still incomplete. And here's why. Here's why the why is incomplete. I've worked with so many students who, in the beginning of starting their college journey, have articulated the most captivating, compelling, like tear-inducing, this is why it's so powerful. And yet, when an obstacle arises, as they invariably do, especially for people whose lives are just more challenging based on systemic racism and maybe they're first generation, low income, there are just a lot of challenges they're facing. They often suddenly are left with, here's the challenge, and I believe that maybe I belong or that I can contend with that challenge. And that's where the opportunity exists in terms of the narrative approach. And to say a little bit more about that, and we'll talk about that here shortly, it's when the challenge arises that we experience feelings. Perhaps it's anxiety or fear, or maybe it's self-doubt or guilt. And in the face of our relationship to that feeling, we can immediately spiral into a disempowered narrative or belief system about who we are, what is possible. And therein lies the opportunity, and therein lies where my work shows up to support people and moving away from those disempowered narratives.
Yeah, that's amazing and makes a lot of sense that you have to start with the why and not go immediately to the how to fix it. That resonates with me for sure. What do you mean by emotional self-regulation and how does it relate to student life?
Yeah, what I realized I forgot about that. So it's like we need to know their how, know their why, but what I was about to say that is missing, it's the who. Who do you know yourself to be? That's the narrative. So those are the three elements that need to be in place to more holistically support student success when they show up as whole people. So that leads me, when talking about showing up as whole people, emotional self-regulation. So we are not taught, I was not taught, most people that I know, my clients, my friends, my family, were not taught really how to emotionally self-regulate. And there are three principles around that my work brings to the fore, which is to say that we have habits of thought, which creates stories and creates beliefs in the face of and in response to how we respond to stress. That shapes our stories. And often those stories and those beliefs and those thought patterns don't even have our own backs. There can be faulty, limiting belief systems. And so it's important to elevate and shine a spotlight on that to recognize where they are not serving us. And then to recognize what are often the feelings that trigger an emotional spiral that amplify a disempowered mindset. Again, fear, anxiety, stress, guilt, anger. And we need to learn to respond to them differently. Okay, so I see we're moving towards feelings because I want to share what we habitually do, all of us, myself included, is that when we experience an uncomfortable feeling, say it's anxiety, we do two things. Number one, we want to run away from it. And it's understandable. Anxiety at its best is highly unpleasant. At its worst, it's painful. And so we want to run, oh my gosh, I'm feeling this. I've got to stop feeling this immediately. And secondly, we identify with it. We feel anxiety and we think, why am I feeling this way? And we quickly make up stories as to why. And either the why is someone else's fault, or more commonly, there's something wrong with me. So instead of it being, you are a person, you are not your feelings, you're a person who experiences feelings and they are temporary, we think, my goodness, there's something wrong with me. So those two responses get us in trouble in our ability to learn to emotionally self-regulate.
And you're talking about feelings and how they interact with the thoughts that students have about themselves and their abilities. Why is it so important to feel your feelings when managing stress and anxiety, and how does that help students get through the experience?
Yeah. Well, because of those two habits of fleeing feelings because they're so uncomfortable, or over-identifying, saying I am my feeling and therefore I am broken and something is wrong with me, it's important to actually touch and feel them. I think, and I say this all the time to people I'm working with, that whatever we resist persists. I think people have probably heard that before, and that is no truer than with our relationship to our feelings. So it's the paradox of, rather than moving away from a feeling, inviting and allowing the feeling is actually the route to help minimize it and let it be something that moves through you, rather than something that just almost like somatizes and gets into your cells. It's the, the issues are in your tissues, people say. Well, rather than going, oh goodness, I'm feeling anxious or scared, and it's so justifiable, particularly now, we try to distract, we numb out, we do anything rather than to tolerate the feeling. And it can even be in little baby steps. I'm going to connect rather than with my head in the story. I'm going to connect with, where am I feeling my feeling? Is it a racing heart? Is it a heaviness in my chest? Do I feel it in my gut? That's when we can shift the conversation. And instead of asking, say, why am I feeling that way? A real pivotal shift that my work teaches people and teaches students is to instead ask, what does the feeling need? What does it need? And really what it needs is comfort and nurturing, but I think we're going to be getting to that shortly, so I don't want to get too far into it.
It's such a compelling question. What does the feeling need? And in our previous conversations, you've used the word, pull up a chair and ask it what it needs. And wow, that just gave me pause, because I'm not sure I always do that when I'm stressed out and you want to just move through it.
Most of us don't.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So what are some common habits then, since most of us don't pull up a chair and ask the feeling what it needs, what are some common habits that people do instead that actually amplify the stress response?
Well, yeah, it goes back to what I'm saying. It's this fleeing, it's this running away, and it's this numbing out, or it's this pathologizing our own response, thinking that we are so broken. And it's like we're being chased by the feeling, or we're being chased by the narrative, and it can foster things like imposter syndrome. Like if one sees how scared I am, or how nervous I am, or how upset I am, then they will see that I am fill in the blank. Not ready, not good enough, don't belong, not capable. And then it just amplifies and concretizes that sense of I need to hide. My feelings are scary. They're not safe. I'm not safe. And so it's so important to do what can feel really counterintuitive, but actually moving towards our feelings. It's really like the portal to some emotional freedom and liberation if you can learn to do it in a way that includes mindfulness. So I have some practices to help, whether it's with breathing exercises or a series of like a question or a mindfulness practice to guide people through how to do that. Does that answer your question?
I'm sorry?
I said, did that answer the question?
Absolutely, yes. And I know firsthand from people who have been watching the news over the last week how stressful it has been to watch these horrific images, and how debilitating it has been for people, both students and people in the workplace, to then just show up to a Zoom call, put on a mask and basically pretend like nothing is going on. And what you're talking about is very empowering language, I think, for everybody to allow themselves to take control, quote unquote, of that moment and say, what is happening, and how can I take a step back and engage with those feelings rather than try to just push them away.
Right. And I like the word engage rather than control, because I feel like the response of running away or over-identifying is trying to control, and that sort of restricted, contracted way magnifies and enhances emotional suffering. Instead, I like that you use the word engage. Let me invite, let me engage, let me touch, because it needs attention. It's an essential part of the human experience to have emotion. So turn towards rather than running away. And again, paradoxically, when we turn towards, we can build and be in a different relationship to our emotions rather than feeling like it's a broken part of who we are that feels insurmountable. And that creates all these thoughts of what if this, and what if this, and what if this, and oh no, which again, given everything that's going on, is incredibly understandable, but our thoughts.
Yeah, and I'm sure that going back to our own college experiences, none of us can really recall administrators or faculty members encouraging us to necessarily feel our feelings. There has always been sort of this, on college campuses, this tendency to view emotions as weak. Yes. And that's probably something that we can all, now that we work on college campuses or with college campuses, that we all aspire to change.
Well, now is the time to change. Now is the time to change, because there's so much going on in terms of shifts and upheavals. And, when we're looking at people being murdered and people dying, I mean, it is a very, very painful time, but it's also an invitation for shifting our ways, or awakening to how can we be different and better, rather than continue to feel broken down, which is what I see. This is what protesters doing. So this is a way of saying,
yeah, exactly.
Much better in terms of who we are becoming.
Taking a step back from that, I'm also curious, because you clarified, right? There's mindfulness, there's narrative therapy, there's also cognitive behavioral therapy, but then there's neuroscience. So could you explain also the relationship between mindfulness and neuroscience that we're learning in science about how mindfulness actually helps the body regulate itself?
thinking of like the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So what I'm thinking about and what I talk about specifically more quickly and remind the basics is talking about what's called an amygdala hijack. And I think we've all been there, many of us most recently, but it's when we have this extreme fear response. And it can be for any reason, whether we're in traffic or we're about to give a presentation or we turn on the news, whatever the case may be, or we're fearful about COVID-19. There's so many reasons why we can have a sense of a hijack. We get into our amygdala, our limbic system, and that's where all the neural pathways are firing. And it keeps us from being in our prefrontal cortex. And our prefrontal cortex is where we have more executive functioning, more cognitive flexibility, where there's more resourcefulness, creativity. The amygdala is the emotional center of our brain, and it's more primitive. And so if we are caught in this heightened sense of anxiety or fear or anger or guilt or any of these feelings that can feel so untenable, how do you interrupt that and start to build new neural pathways and habits? This is all about neuroplasticity. Everyone's talking about it, to help us move from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. And that's where mindfulness comes in. And that's where these guided mindfulness practices can help. But if you find yourself in sort of this hijacked moment where you're like, I don't know how to think or calm down, breathing. There is, and if anyone wants to look it up, it's included in the material, but you can look it up. It's Dr. Andrew Weil, and it's one of my very favorite breathing techniques. It's called the 4-7-8 breathing technique, and it takes literally less than a minute, and it helps to soothe and calm the nervous system so that prior to going into a mindfulness exercise, into a difficult conversation, walking into a room, walking into a meeting, you are helping yourself to move out of the amygdala and access the resources and the creativity of the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah. Wow. And there's language that we can tell students that feel like there's something wrong with them when they're stressed out, right? That shows that it's very normal to go through.
We need to normalize this. We are all in this together in terms of experiencing fear.
Yeah, I mean, Victoria just said, I found that some students don't make use of such centers because they feel there is a negative stigma attached, right? That's exactly what I think we're also talking about, is that in our experience and because of this idea that mental health equals suicide prevention, right? That you have to kind of cross that threshold where it's already so bad that you need to find, mental health resources, versus there's actually, everybody can benefit.
Everybody can benefit, because if you're human, you're experiencing moments of having an amygdala hijack, an emotional spiral, moments of fear. Absolutely.
Yeah, and we'll go to the next slide now, and we'll talk a little bit about what you've created to help with this, remind the basics, and maybe you can talk a little bit about your partnership with Perceivant, and then in what way is your material relevant and helpful for higher education, for students, but also for those of us who are working with students.
Yeah, well, I hope that's becoming clear as I'm speaking now, that you're seeing the relevance of it. And yes, it's extremely timely right now. But like you were mentioning, since 2007, I had been working in higher ed. I worked specifically for an organization, a company called Inside Track, and they partner with colleges and universities across the nation to help with persistence and retention. And when I started, it was just such an amazing fit in terms of my background as a therapist. But for the last 3 years, I had been working on my own as a consultant, working with nonprofit organizations and other companies and businesses to help support students, in particularly first-generation low-income students. And I was realizing it was not like, oh, suddenly realized this, but it just became so abundantly clear that I want and need, and the world needs this to get to more students, and training other coaches to do it takes a long time. And it can be cost prohibitive. And I was thinking, how can this be scalable and how can it be put directly in front of students and given to instructors and teachers so that they have everything that they need to be able to implement this learning material, teaching social emotional intelligence in this way to help ameliorate all the emotional suffering that gets in the way of student success. And so serendipity being what it is, long story short, a gentleman I used to work with out of the blue called me as I'm scratching my head thinking I need to get this in front of people. And he had said, I have an opportunity for you for a different type of position. And I said, well, what's the company? And he said it was Perceivant and they publish courses for higher ed. And I almost fell off my chair. And it's like, this is exactly what needs to happen here. And so I was fortunate enough to partner with Perceivant and take all that was in my head and with their brilliance, with their instructional design and their art design, they were able to take my material and create a book and create a course that is direct to students. And it has everything that is needed in terms of, especially right now, with people going online, but it's online, it's hybrid, it's, on a ground campus, whatever is needed, but it has the instructional design, the instructor guidelines, it has all the activities, opportunities for journaling, has all the mindfulness exercises, all the narrative coaching included in it. So yes, a scalable solution.
And how is it delivered to faculty, staff, and students exactly? Like if somebody wanted to imagine how this would be used by the various groups that it targets, how is it delivered to them?
Well, it can be a standalone course or it can be a supplement to a different course. So some people are using it in first-year college experiences, freshman seminars. Some people are using it in health and wellness courses. It's been used in so many different courses. It's just beginning to go out. But it's can be modified to the need of the institution, the course, the instructor, and the students. And again, it's entirely built out so that it's sort of plug and play. All the material has been created so the student can benefit from the learning directly.
Wow, that's really helpful. And Tariq said in the chat, I recently joined AU, but in my previous job, we were trained in mental health first aid, which was great for people without counseling experience, but may be exposed to students experiencing mental health issues. That's interesting to hear also. There's probably various approaches across various campuses, and it sounds like Remind fits in very well with existing approaches also.
Right. That was the intention. Absolutely. And that goes back to the word that I used at the beginning, which is tapestry. My hope is that it is part of a tapestry, a web of support and resources for students so that we can continue to elevate our awareness and normalize the need. It's such a human need for us to learn to emotionally self-regulate and become more emotionally intelligent and resilient.
Yeah. Well, your expertise is very much needed in the world right now, and we thank you for it and for sharing it with us as practitioners. Before we move into our Q&A section, I have one last question for you, which is, can you give some examples of narrative coaching questions that might help students manage their anxiety right now in this moment that we're in?
Yeah. So narrative coaching really is broken into two categories, and one is externalizing problems, and the other is finding exceptions to problem-saturated stories. So when you're externalizing a problem, and I'm not saying that feelings are problems, but if we ignore them and they grow in magnitude, they can become problematic. So an externalized narrative question would be something like, when you experience something stressful, how does fear show up and convince you that you're incapable of moving forward? What is its influence in limiting possibility? How does it keep you from remembering other important aspects of who you are? Those are externalizing questions. Finding exceptions to problem-saturated stories would be something like, share a time when fear was present, but it wasn't as dialed up, and more essential parts or strengths showed up in your life. who in your life would be least surprised to know that you practiced those skills or those abilities or that part of who you are? Again, things like adaptability or resilience or perseverance or whatever it may be. If you saw someone else in the face of fear be able to still step forward and take responsibility in the way that you did, what words might you use to describe him or her? So those are just small examples, and what they are doing is that they are updating a narrative so that rather than connecting to brokenness, you can start to, students can start to connect to, no, that's not all true. So it interrupts faulty thinking and again, elevates sort of the strength of who we are so that we can connect with and use those strengths as an organizing principle of our self-concepts. So much more empowering.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. I know they're relevant for anyone, any human being who has feelings that sometimes are uncomfortable, right? But what we talked about, you and me in a previous conversation, which I thought was really, really true, is that it's particularly helpful for college students because, or anybody who is going through a higher education experience, because they have signed up to change their lives during this experience, right? It's very intentional. Yes, it's about career outcomes, but it's also about transformation of the person. So what better time in our lives to learn how to engage our feelings more deeply, how to move through them with more confidence, and how to see them as very healthy and normal.
Right, and I just saw a question come up, like when is a good time for Remind to be brought to students?
Mm-hmm.
Anytime. Ideally, as soon as possible, but if that's just not something that can happen in your institution, it's better to get it later than not at all. Anytime is good to start to learn to emotionally self-regulate and to start to engage in activities that help people to shine a light on where their personal sense of self is disempowered and how to build the capacity to build greater resilience in their sense of self. So anytime is a good time, ideally when they first get started.
When they start in an orientation or right before they even start on the academic side, or should they already be somewhat in the middle of the stress of the first semester to find this the most helpful? What do you think?
Well, I like the idea of being as proactive as possible. So the more that you are building these skills and adopting these coping strategies, the more you will be resilient when the next challenge arises. However, like I said, if that's not possible, anytime. I work with adults in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they're working with me to learn these things. Would it have been ideal had I been able to work with them when they were 19, 20, 21? Sure, but it's still incredibly important and worthwhile, even if you're older.
Yeah, and Andrea says, indeed, we want students to know, recognize, and own how they show up. I love how you worded that, Andrea, for themselves in the classroom and their communities. Yes, yes.
Exactly.
Okay, well, this concludes the interview portion of our webinar, and we will move into the Q&A, so we can't wait to engage even more. And we will kick it off with just one question for you all. Please comment in the chat. What are the benefits for the students at your institution in managing student mental and emotional health in more proactive ways? So call out any benefits that come to mind, academic and non-academic. And do feel free to also pose your own questions and provide additional comments and thoughts in the chat as well. I mean, I think back to my own college experience and how beneficial this would have been.
Yeah,
right?
Mine as well. So much so.
Yeah. Not just from an academic perspective, but also from just a social emotional perspective. There's a lot that goes on college campuses. Even positive stressors can get quite overwhelming when everything happens at once.
That's right. And I think of also as we transition into the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they learn their triggers. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so how does that help students to learn their triggers? Does that mean they can anticipate better?
The anticipate, yeah. The proactive piece, like, okay, I know that this may be happening. When this happens, this is my habit of thinking. I talk about like spells of thinking or trance of thinking or habits of thinking. So if this is the trigger and I have this like stimulus response, here are my neural pathways deeply grooved, and I just immediately go there, how do I start to practice responding differently?
Yeah. And we have another comment that says, ideally, more students would successfully manage courses, have fewer failures course to course. And I'm assuming by failure, we mean literally like failure to complete the course, right?
Yeah. You know, when I first was designing this, and it was actually before I started designing it, I thought ideally, I was like, I think it would be great if it was like a freshman seminar course and also for students on academic probation. And we have one institution that uses it that way for students who are on academic probation. But again, I love the idea of proactive, but it's also to recognize, well, we fail, we fall down and we get back up, but let's give them not just the like, you know, that's not good. Here, we'll help you up. There's such a stigma and a shame. I've worked with many students on academic probation, and whoa, the disempowered narratives that come about as a result of that. To understand that, you know, there's a lot of growth mindset that is also involved in remind the basics. Let's help you rise again.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe others on this call are also parents. Almost certainly, I know you are a parent as well, Kristin. How can we prepare our children even before they get to college to engage more deeply with their feelings as well?
Yeah. No, in my I have 3 kids. Two are grown, but one is 12, soon to be 12, and they're studying social emotional intelligence, and I'm thrilled. I am thrilled.
I bet you. You're like, get ready. Victoria says, strengthening mental health can help students share their voice effectively so it can be heard and considered so we can all benefit. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Any other benefits that come to mind that we want to call out? I think calmness is the one that comes to mind for me, just the idea that I could have had a more calm experience on campus. Tracy says you will have a more holistic, healthier campus community. That's such a nice thought.
And I think shared language, and it goes back to this idea of normalizing. You know, if someone fell down, you know, there'd be no shame in scabbing a knee, or someone, you know, had diabetes and they needed to have some insulin to help regulate their blood sugar. There's no shame in it. But when we're finding that we're struggling emotionally, there's such a different relationship to it.
I love that you use the word shame, because it's such a surefire way to get into an emotional storm, right? When you're ashamed. Yeah,
that's right. I saw a question come up a couple times. Are there any negative? And I didn't get to read it all the time. Negative, and I would like to say negative. Excuse me. I like to say I would like to say narrative coaching rather than therapy. And narrative, the difference between coaching and therapy is that coaching is focusing on mostly the here and now and forward, whereas therapy goes really deep into sort of wounded stories from the past. So I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but negative.
Like, I'm wondering if Tariq means not just in the term narrative therapy, but when we get kind of work with students to get those narratives out of them that are potentially hindering them from being their best selves or experiencing their best college experience. Is it like a word like failure, or like what I was saying before, control? You know, are those sort of words that we should avoid? What other examples can you?
Yeah, I don't think so. And here's the reason why narrative, I think, is so compatible to students and people who aren't narrative coaches to be able to use it, is because it's so looking through the lens of capacity rather than woundedness or deficiency. So anytime there are problems or challenges, you can immediately externalize. It's not that the person or student is broken or deficient. It's the relationship to the challenge as an opportunity to be re-examined. And, you know, looking for exceptions to problem-saturated stories, you're not zoning in and zooming into where's the brokenness in you. It's saying, where are the times where the effects of the problem or the unattended feeling didn't hijack you? So it's anti-pathologizing, so to speak.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? So how does that work? So you think of a time when a similar circumstance did not trigger you and you try
Yeah,
to bring it.
yes. So it's finding what are called unique outcomes, finding the times when the influence of a problem, like a mindset problem, maybe it's procrastination, maybe it's avoidance, maybe it's fear. Let's remember the times when it wasn't in the driver's seat. And how do we unpack that, shine a light on that, and amplify that as a story you can connect with and use as an organizing principle of who you know yourself to be?
Yeah. Because then if you have the narrative of, I always do this, that narrative no longer holds, right? You
Well,
found,
it'll try to hold. I tell you what, it'll try to hold. But even our language. So in the book, I talk about the importance of our language. We always listen. I just did it right there. We use language like we always, we never. Things like I am so angry. It's like we're saying I am anger, right? We're deconstructing even the language we use and recognizing that very few things are seldom, always, or never. It's finding the times when if someone says, oh man, I always procrastinate, well, that's not true. Think of the times when you didn't, and let's really inquire into those as a way of dismantling the tendency towards always and recognizing you already have a lot of the building blocks in place. Let's just continue to, it's, when you focus on something, it grows. Let's focus differently.
yeah. Wow, it's such good stuff. As I've told you before, I really enjoy listening to you speak about this topic, and I'm sure everybody else benefited just as much. And we want to end with just giving people a few resources to look at if they want to engage more deeply with your work. Perceivant is the publisher of Remind and Remind the Basics. You can request a demo and receive a $50 honorarium, which is pretty cool. So here's the link for that. You can also email Kristin directly at coachkristintaylor@gmail.com and let us know how we can help. As I said at the beginning, Tarragona is a higher education consulting firm. If we go to the next slide, we have a few of our services highlighted and contact information as well. Contact at tarragonaassociates.com. We're always very happy to do completely free and non-binding conversations with you and your team. A few examples of how our services can help you increase student success and satisfaction. I think the conversation with Kristin today illuminated that we're focusing on that, improving faculty and staff buy-in and engagement, enhancing the health of your enrollment and retention pipelines. We also can help with budgets and just institutional revenue and sustainability, which is going to be more important as this pandemic continues, and protect the integrity of your academic promise and mission. So with that, we are out of time. Thank you so very much for coming today. Kristin, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And we did record this webinar, and we will share the link with you as well as the PowerPoint slides in a day or so. So with that, stay healthy and stay calm and have a great rest of your day and week.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.